This is a continuation of lecture number 35, The Empire Strikes Back, this time in Panama, so it'll be 35B. And we had just gotten up to the point of the Comintern being formed in 1919, and the way that's going to enter the picture. Now, because in one of the planks of the Comintern program in 1919 was in opposition to the U.S. control of the Panamanian Canal Zone. Now, you will recall that Michael Borodin had been sent by Lenin to try and clean up that mess in Chicago with two competing communist parties in 1918, and then, most importantly, to get to Mexico and form the Mexican Communist Party. He did that, and one of the most important tasks of the Mexican Communist Party was to set up a bureau that would organize the rest of Latin America, which he did. Now, he didn't really have to send that many agents around that is, his pick man, Jose Allen, didn't have to send that many agents to Latin America because Latin American intellectuals were flooding into Mexico City to see him. Now, among those, there were Panamanians that came from Panama City and Colón, and they did the same thing that all the others were, talked about what was happening in the world, and spent enough time in Mexico City to get their marching orders before they returned to Panama. Now, let's take a look at what the Comintern, of course, took a strong position against the U.S. occupation of that Panama and about its history of imperialist overthrow of the Colombian province and ripping that Colombian province away from the nation of Colombia. And at any rate, what about the U.S. financial injection into the country's economy and workforce that followed that? The changes brought about by the canal venture were overall positive for Panama. It sanitized the area before and during construction, and engineers developed an infrastructure to treat potable water, sewage, and garbage. This system encompassed the canal zone in the cities of Panama and Colón. And these economic features prove that capitalism, even in its terminal imperialist phase, can still have positive contributions to make in the evolution of the mode of production. This corresponds to elementary Marxist and Leninist theory. Accordingly, in standards in construction, transportation, and landscaping of the canal zone's urbanization during the first half of the 20th century had no parallel in tropical regions in the hemisphere. Dr. William Gorgas used techniques pioneered by the Cuban physician, Dr. Carlos Finley, to rid the area of yellow fever between 1902 and 1905. Gorgas' work in the sanitation of the canal zone and the cities of Panama and Colón eventually made Drs. Gorgas and Finley world famous. The Panama Canal, that is the area supporting the canal, and the remaining U.S. military industrial bases were turned over to Panama on December 31st, 1919. And as you can imagine, we're going to talk about it now, a long history of struggle for the Panamanians to regain control of that territory. The political character of the U.S. takeover was that from 1903 until 1968, Panama was a republic dominated by a commercially oriented oligarchy, the 10 families. However, under the anti-Soviet Truman Doctrine during the 1940s, the Panamanian military began to challenge the oligarchy's political hegemony. And this challenge continued under new U.S. management into the 1950s. The CIA organized the January 9, 1964 Martyrs' Day riots in Panama. This escalated tensions between the Panamanian rulers and the labor movement in the country that had long been simmering against the U.S. government and which was led by Orthodox communists. The immediate demand triggered by the Truman Doctrine under LBJ's newest management was over the U.S. long-term occupation of the Canal Zone. 20 Martyrs' Day rioters were killed, and 500 Panamanian civilians living nearby were wounded. In October 1968, Dr. Arnulfo Arias Madrid was elected president for the third time. Twice ousted by the Panamanian military, he was ousted again as president by the National Guard after only 10 days in office. A military junta government was established, and the commander of the National Guard, Brigadier General Omar Torrijos, emerged as the principal power in Panamanian political life. Now, this was brought about a kind of a shocking change, because Torrijos quickly emerged as a left leader in Latin America. But you have to understand what that means. Just as the Panamanian ruling class had divided between outright fascists who are now had been favored by the US CIA and the Pentagon, but on the other hand, the majority of the ruling class of the oligarchy in Panama was concerned about the fact that they were being pushed out of business by all of these gringo businessmen who had unlimited financial resources. So they had tended to become more nationalistic, and it was this base upon which Omar Torrijos, the general who commanded the National Guard that threw out Dr. Arias, was able to build. And what he did was to put together the communist-led unions and these permanently pissed off petty bourgeois elements and large liberal belt bourgeois elements that Graham Greene writes about in his book, The Tailor of Panama. Well, at any rate, so Torrijos forms this alliance between industrial and farm workers on the one hand, and the comprador oligarchy that's against the allowing the U.S. too much rain on the other, and forms a government which was reasonably stable for quite a while. So the U.S. gives in, kind of. On September 7th, 1977, there was a new U.S.-Panama Treaty signed by the Panamanian head of state, Omar Torrijos, and U.S. President Jimmy Carter. You'll recall that when we were talking about Venezuela, Hugo Chavez became a good friend of Omar Torrijos' son when they were both in the military academy together in Caracas. And Torrijos' son invited Chavez, as a young man going to college with him, to visit Panama City, and that's where he got his first full indoctrination into anti-imperialism of the Torrijos variety. At any rate, these treaties allowed for the complete transfer of the canal eventually, as well as removal of the 14 U.S. Army bases from Panama. All of this was to be done by 1999. These treaties also granted the U.S. a perpetual right of military intervention. Certain portions of the zone and increasing responsibility over the canal were turned over in the intervening years, but the gringo imperialists had gained time to corrupt whomever took over next. And now we come to the rather infamous character Manuel Noriega and his regime, which lasted from 1983 to 1989, and his takeover begins when Torrijos died in a mysterious airplane crash on the August 1st of 1981. Now, Torrijos' death was an assassination organized by the CIA. Thus, the gringos changed the direction of Panama's political evolution. Washington had a new boss for Panama, namely General Manuel Noriega. He was head of the Panama Defense Forces, or PDF, that dominated political life behind a facade of civilian government. He was firmly in control, that is, Manuel Noriega, a general, firmly in control of both the PDF and the civilian government, but his rule was mainly via a private army of the thugs the CIA had organized for him, called the Dignity Battalions, and their job was to suppress opposition. Graham Greene describes this development in his book about Noriega and in the movie thus inspired called The Tailor of Panama. These Dignity Battalions were carbon copies of Papa Doc Duvalier's Tonton Macoutes in Haiti, which Greene had earlier described in his book, and later Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton's movie, The Comedians. It would be well worth your while to read the Graham Greene trilogy, which is Our Man in Havana, The Comedians, and The Tailor of Panama, to get a real flavor of this particular area. These are the books that I grew up with, the time period that I was moving around down there. There was undercover collaboration with U.S. President Ronald Reagan for his Contra War in Nicaragua, including the infamous Iran-Contra affair, specifically to deliver drugs by airplane from the Central Andes to Panama for transshipment to Gringolandia. In the process, Noriega was getting too big for his Kulak britches. Here I'm using the term Kulak the way the Russian czars used it to refer to their countryside fist bosses. Kulak is the Russian word for fist, who they used to rule over the mass of small and middle peasants. However, unlike his Russian forebears and namesakes, who had always known their place, this Kulak made it certain that relations between the U.S. and Panama worsened in the 1980s. Noriega made the fatal error of initiating a domestic political crisis which featured an attack on the U.S. Embassy. This time, Noriega was up against U.S. Vice President George H.W. Bush, who had become the undisputed boss of the U.S. ruling families after his successful supervision of the assassination of JFK. Watch Richard Francis Connolly's JFK to 9/11, Everything is a Rich Man's Trick, for the most complete expose of this George H.W. Bush-run plot. President Reagan froze economic and military aid to Panama in the summer of 1987, and tensions sharpened in February 1988 when Noriega was indicted in U.S. courts for drug trafficking. In April 1988, Reagan invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, freezing Panamanian government assets in U.S. banks, withholding fees for using the canal, and prohibiting payments by U.S. agencies, firms, and individuals to the Noriega regime. The country of Panama went into turmoil. Vice President Bush was now boss in formality as well as reality as he took office as the 41st Gringo president on January 20th, 1989. Bush was not about to let a two-bit piece of shit pawn like Noriega get away with anything. My own sources told me that this was the way Bush routinely referred to Noriega in his conversations. And he's, Bush had, after all, handled the JFK situation, and JFK, who was a real opponent, now he would do away with this lowlife. In the Panamanian national elections of May 1989, Guillermo Endora won by a margin of over 3-1 against Noriega. However, the Noriega regime promptly annulled the election, provoking George H.W. Bush beyond anything the nearly illiterate Noriega could have imagined by daring to cite massive U.S. interference. And that was the end of him, and the reintroduction of direct U.S. rule. Bush said, and I got this from a reliable source, I'm going to teach that pineapple-faced cocksucker a lesson he will never forget. The Spanish phrase, cara de cratones, cara piña, chupando de los pingas, hijo de puta, all of these Bush managed to string together in his angry description of what he was going to do to this guy. And I suspect much of this he probably picked up from his years of working with Jorge Diaz Serrano, his close partner in Mexico, who was the #1 leading libertine rake of his time in that period, who was famous for his ability to swear. But at any rate, wherever he may have learned it, he had a reasonably good command of colloquial Spanish when it came to these kinds of references. But at any rate, I might say that this also brings up the most recent idiotic TV miniseries I've seen called Narcos, where the DEA agent in charge of getting Pablo Escobar tells his own story. But it's a stupid series based on a totally, completely inaccurate recounting of the events that occurred down there and the personalities of the people involved, except for the DEA guys, who are the ones that wrote it and narrate it, and they changed their names, so they have different characters, but these are guys that can't speak Spanish, are completely without any clue as to what's going on in the world of Colombia, and have the hubris and audacity, arrogance to intervene in Colombian affairs by ordering the locals around, including the local cops and generals and so on, as if they were the real bosses. you have to put yourself back in this time period to realize that this was the operating mechanism by which these people worked. As a matter of fact, they've continued that right up through their war against Iraq and Syria and so on. And now they're getting thrown out of everywhere. But at any rate, enough asides on this. The U.S. began sending thousands of troops to bases in the Canal Zone. Panamanian authorities knew U.S. troops left their bases, stopping and searching vehicles in Panama. This should have been a clue to Noriega that his day was about over, and an American Marine got lost in the former French quarter of Panama City, ran a roadblock, and was shot dead by Panamanian police, who were another part of the Noriega's military. And that was it. On December 20th, 1989, U.S. troops began an invasion of Panama. They achieved their objectives and began to withdraw on December 27th. So in 1 week, Bush wiped out this entire operation of Noriega's. The U.S. was obligated to return control of the canal to Panama on January 1st, 1990, due to a treaty signed decades before, and he was going to stick to that, but with his own guy in power. Endora was sworn in as president at a U.S. military base on the day of the invasion. Noriega was captured and served a 40-year sentence for drug trafficking. However, he was held in luxury in Florida as a prisoner of war. At least 7,000 Panamanians lost their lives. U.S. troops buried many corpses in mass graves which have not been found, or they threw them into the sea. Much of the Torrijos barrio was destroyed by fire soon after the start of the invasion due to the testing of incendiary devices by the U.S. military. After the invasion, U.S. President George H.W. Bush announced a $1 billion program of aid to Panama. As usual with the Bush gang, half of this aid was a gift from American taxpayers to themselves and few friends. The same old Zapata Petroleum offshore gang that we've discussed before in this series was back at it again. This time the robbery was accomplished by having $400 million, consisting of incentives for U.S. businesses to export products to Panama. Another $150 million was to pay off bank loans, and $65 million went into private sector loans and guarantees to U.S. investors, and I can tell you that all of it worked into the pockets of Bush and his gang. Now, after Noriega, from 1989 to the present, this is the most important recent period. In the morning of December 20th, 1989, only hours after the invasion started, the presumptive winner of the May 1989 elections, Guillermo Endora, was sworn in as president of Panama at a U.S. military installation in the Canal Zone. On December 27th, Panama's electoral tribunal invalidated the Noriega's regime's annulment of the May 1989 election and confirmed the victory of opposition candidates Endora and Vice Presidents Guillermo Ford and Ricardo Arias Calderon. President Endora took office as the head of a four-party minority government, pledging to foster Panama's economic recovery, transform the Panamanian military into a police force under civilian control, and strengthen democratic institutions. During its 5-year term, the Endora government struggled to meet the public's high expectations. Its new police force proved to be a major improvement, but the oligarchy wanted their own guy as soon as possible. So, it became the same old gang with a new boss. Ernesto Perez Valladares was sworn in as president on December 1st, 1994. He had been the candidate for a three-party coalition dominated by the Democratic Revolutionary Party, PRD, the erstwhile political arm of the military dictatorship during the Torrijos and Noriega years. A longtime member of the PRD, Perez Valladares worked skillfully during the campaign to rehabilitate the PRD's image, emphasizing the party's populist Torrijos roots rather than its association with Noriega. And he won the election with only 33% of the vote, when the major non-PRD forces, unable to agree on a joint candidate, splintered into competing factions and divided up the oppositional vote. That is, beyond the 33%. His administration carried out their economic reforms and, of course, worked closely with the U.S. on implementation of the canal treaties. On May 2nd, 1999, Rita Moscow, the widow of the former President Arnulfo Arias Madrid, defeated PRD candidate Martin Torrijos, son of the late dictator. Moscow took office on September 1st, 1999. During her administration, Moscow tried to strengthen social programs, especially for child and youth development, protection, and general welfare. Education programs were prioritized. Moscow focused on bilateral and multilateral free trade initiatives with the hemisphere. Her administration successfully handled the Panama Canal transfer and has been effective in administering the canal. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration had praised the role of Manuel Noriega before his falling out with the U.S. over his own drug dealing. The new Panamanian government expanded money laundering legislation and concluded a new counter-narcotics maritime agreement and a stolen vehicles agreement with the U.S. Now, just a comment on that. The U.S. DEA is always composed of a large number of people actively involved in the drug business. It's been that way from its beginning, and it continues to be that way to this very day. So many of them were deeply involved in the drug trafficking, and you can make, a guy who is used to being on the public tit and getting a regular salary of $30,000-$40,000 a year. Maybe they could get it jacked up a little bit more with their foreign service back in those days. All of a sudden has a chance to make $10-20 million and retire for life. Well, what's he going to do? Well, most of them do that. So the DEA was something the FBI wanted to exist because they didn't want this drug enforcement business for themselves, because from the days of Hoover on up, they knew that that if that happened, then they would lose control of most of their agents that were working in that area, and they didn't want that to happen. So the DEA was a buffer that the FBI liked to have. And today, if you end up in a federal prison anywhere, you're going to meet a lot of DEA agents that are doing time because they got caught. And whether they think it's worth it or whatnot, I've talked to many of them, depends on how much money they made. If they didn't make enough money, then they think they got screwed. And if they did make enough money, then they're just laughing it off. But at any rate, that's all of this thing about Noriega and the DEA. They had been strongly supporting him before he made the serious mistake of thinking that he could push George H.W. Bush around, and he found out the hard way that that wasn't going to happen. Bush was not about to let a guy like that tell him what he could and couldn't do when, after all, Bush had already handled JFK. And so, the Panamanian government under Mrs. Moscow also enforced the intellectual property rights and concluded the very important bilateral investment treaty amendment with the U.S. and an agreement with the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. The Moscow administration signed on to the obligatory United States so-called campaign combating international terrorism. In 2004, Martin Torrijos again ran for president, and this time he won handily. He was succeeded by Ricardo Martinelli in July 1st, 2009, and on July 1st, 2014, he in turn was succeeded by Juan Carlos Varela. Prensa Latina reported on September 21st of this year, 2015, that the First Lady of Panama, Lorena Castillo, wife of Juan Carlos Varela, said relations with Cuba are at an important moment, and among the issues of interest to both nations is fighting HIV/AIDS. She said, Cuba is the first Latin American country to eradicate HIV. Panama has almost epidemic alarming figures, so we have a lot to learn from them, and everyone should get tested. Prensa Latina continues among the many messages posted in her account after attending the Mass celebrated yesterday by Pope Francis in Havana. She highlighted the invitation to the Pope to visit her country in 2019. I bring to you the message of faith and love of all the people of Panama. Holy Father, we hope for your visit to our country in 2019. We are waiting, she wrote. Castillo, who visited the Caribbean island, Cuba, last week, stressed the spirit of unity and brotherhood that the continent lives today, and that is why Panama is present in this papal journey. Unity and blessings to whole of America Panama is present. In other words, she went up there for the Pope's visit with Raul Castro. Whoever does not live to serve does not serve to live, she said, referring to one of the phrases that the Bishop of Rome said during the first Mass in Revolution Square in Havana. There is no true peace if it is not accompanied by fairness, truth, justice, and solidarity, said the First Lady, in reference to a message by Pope John Paul II, who was the first Pope to visit Cuba in 1998. Lorena Castillo traveled last Thursday to the island of Cuba in order to seek experiences in the conservation of Old Havana and education for children with physical and motor disabilities in the Special School of Solidarity with Panama, which recently was visited by Panamanian President Juan Carlos Varela. The Cubans have an extremely advanced system of special needs education, which I thought, when I was there 13 years ago, was amazing, considering the fact that Cuba is a poor country in terms of, thanks to the U.S. blockade, it has to watch every penny that it's got, and yet it has spent an incredible amount of resources in taking care of people who, which we call people that need special needs over here. The other thing that I remember that struck me so much at the time was that from my hotel, looking out from the bar at the top over the city, the thing that struck me the most was that there are no signs. There's no Coca-Cola signs and all the kind of signs that I saw for the very first time that I visited Mexico City in 1962. The whole city's covered with signs everywhere. And but in Cuba, there are no signs on all these buildings. And it looks exactly like Havana would have looked like 400 years ago in that sense. And they have been steadily refurbishing all of these older buildings. Well, anyway, that's just another aside. At any rate, as part of the work of the Secretariat for Coordination of Community Affairs headed by Panama's First Lady, has included the attention to social issues such as management support of the national government. The agenda also included a meeting with Cardinal Jaime Ortega, Archbishop of Havana, before returning to her country on Monday. The first Latin American Pope concludes tomorrow his visit. This is the story that President Latina was carrying. His visit to the Caribbean country in the eastern province of Santiago de Cuba, from where he will travel to the U.S. to visit New York, Washington, and Philadelphia. This last city will host the 8th World Meeting of Families. Pope Francis will also attend the 70th Assembly of the United Nations in New York, where he is expected to speak. And then again on September 21st, from Panama City, President Latina reported a memorandum of understanding on agricultural cooperation between Panama and Cuba, and it was signed there that day by the Minister of Agricultural Development. Prensa Latina Latin Press is the Cuban news service, equivalent to AP up here, or whatever international news service you might be familiar with. At any rate, Jorge Arango, the Minister of Agricultural Development, and the Cuban Ambassador, Antonio Pardo, signed these agreements between Panama and Cuba. The agreements so far are mainly in the scientific technical area. The first project to be implemented will be the use in Panama of Cuban experiences in urban agriculture and greenhouse crops, stated the ambassador. This agreement is the result of a recent visit of President Juan Carlos Varela to Cuba, which increased the relations between the two countries, with emphasis in trade and the links between Panama's Colon Free Zone and the Cuban port of Mariel, stated Pardo. Mariel is about 20 miles north of Havana. It was kind of made famous by the Mariel boat lift back in the days of Scarface, if you've seen that movie. But today, it's one of the biggest developing ports in the world and a big international trade center. And the difference that has occurred in the years between Scarface and now is qualitative. At any rate, the minister recalled the similarities of both nations in climatic conditions, traditions, crops, livestock, rustic buildings, and even the peasants, which allows a more efficient and better collaboration. The former president is already facing several investigations of alleged corruptions since fleeing the country in January. Panama's former president Ricardo Martinelli is facing wide criticism again after the Panama Supreme Court admitted Wednesday 2 new cases of alleged corruption against him, and the cases will be added to 4 other corruption charges this former president is facing. 2 cases against a member of the Central American Parliament, Parlacen, were admitted, said a statement released by the Panama Supreme Court of Justice. Though the statement does not mention Martinelli's name for legal reasons, the former president himself confirmed the charges on Twitter, adding that courts are trying to falsely incriminate him. One of the new corruption cases that Martinelli now faces by Panama's stock market regulation, a regulator who asked for an investigation into whether Martinelli was insider trading on shares of the Canadian mining corporation Petaquilla through the brokerage firm Financial Pacific, reported Reuters. The second case is related to a previous corruption scandal, alleging that a company contracted by Martinelli's administration was accepting bribes, according to Reuters. Some of the other corruption scandals Martinelli has faced include embezzlement and wiretapping during his time in office. One of the larger scandals include a US $45 million embezzlement scheme forcing officials to sign improper contracts. One was with a dried fruit company for millions of dollars of fruit, which the government allegedly handed to students as part of a social program. The former president, Martinelli, fled the country in January, hours before the Supreme Court announced it would investigate corruption during his administration, and he has been in self-imposed exile in Florida in the U.S. ever since, along with hundreds, if not thousands, of other former corrupt officials who have been able traditionally to find a sanctuary in the United States, especially in Florida. And I could go through a long list of those. Some are more infamous than others. Some are just old-fashioned crooks like this guy. Some are real enemies of humanity, like the guy that blew up the Venezuelan Cuban airline and has been given sanctuary for life in Miami. Well, at any rate, that brings us to a conclusion of our Panama series of lectures. And what we're going to go to next is what's called Operation Condor. I'm going to do a whole lecture on that and kind of cover Condor throughout Latin America. And then we're going to go back to Venezuela, Guyana, Colombia, Ecuador, country by country, and deal with the details of the last several decades so that you can see what the communists in these countries are up against and what they have been up against and where they've been successful and where they're making progress and what the U.S. is doing to try and counter any kind of progressive activity in these countries. So with that comment, I'm going to stop this lecture 35B.